Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. My name is Yusuf Ismail, and we are back with this exciting program that we have in store for all of you on confronting Islamophobia and some of the crucial misconceptions that exist in the world. If you're watching us, you can watch us on ITV networks, on DSTV 347, on the major, massive YouTube channel called Souk Islam, probably the largest Islamic channel in Africa, on the airwaves of Salam Media, as well as the airwaves of Channel Islam International. So you've got your options whether to watch us on the screen, alternatively, listen to us on the airwaves. Now, this evening, we have an exciting guest, an individual who I would consider an elder brother of mine. I've met him now on 2 occasions personally. He's a very stimulating individual, Ustad Sheikh Adnan Rashid, and he'll be tackling the issue of confronting some of the misconceptions pertaining to jihad, but more about that a little later. Adnan Rashid is an individual that has been active in dawah for a number of years. He has visited over 30 countries. He has attained a number of ijazas in hadith from reputable hadith authorities. As I understand, he has attained his BA with honors in history from Birkbeck College at the University of London. And to my knowledge, and he can correct me, he has finished his postgraduate studies in history at the School for Oriental and African Studies. He has also appeared on Islamic channels such as Iqra TV, Islam channel in the United Kingdom. He has taught Sirah, Tafsir, Hadith. He has operated as a khatib, senior researcher, as well as a lecturer some time back at IERA. And I've had the privilege of, in fact, hosting him twice in South Africa, at least. And the last time, I believe it's some years back, 2017, 2018, long before COVID hit the scene. And he had some exciting debates at one of the major churches in South Africa. And certainly he's somebody up there that is viewed as an individual with some degree of authority in discussions on comparative religion. If you go to Speaker's Corner every week, you're going to probably see him. I'm not so sure if it's as common as it is now during the onset of COVID, but he is somebody that has established his name throughout the apologetic and Islamic debating world. And today he's going to be focusing on the idea of jihad, but not just simply the concept of jihad, but more particularly the idea that has attained discourse within the far-right perspective, and particularly even amongst missionary circles, about the idea that Hindus, both historically and presently, strangely enough, have experienced ongoing religious persecution and systematic violence in the form of forced conversions, documented massacres, demolition and desecration of temples, as well as the destruction of educational centers, which have basically a Hindu particular background. And this whole argument is centered around the fact that this was religiously mandated by virtue of the fact that Muslims were engaging in jihad. The Mughal conquests of India were a holy war that were aimed at committing ethnic cleansing, massacre of Hindus, rape of Hindu women, and totally annihilation of the entire Hindu culture. Notwithstanding the fact that there have been several instances in the 20th century of religious violence, in fact, the other way around, against Muslims since the partitions, sectarian violence, Hindu nationalist mobs attacking Muslims, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh attacking Muslims, being part and parcel of this communal violence that has been emerging and happening in India since 1950. Well, I'm not going to go too much into this discussion, but I want Sheikh Adnan to, in fact, chart the history out for us in terms of whether there is a reality to the idea that, as some would argue, and as people like Robert Spencer and so on have argued, that the actual destruction of Hindu society began with Mahmud Ghazni, allegedly, in the 10th century, and this then led to centuries of pogroms, massacres, and destruction of Hindu society. So I'm going to leave this over to Adnan, and he's going to share his particular expertise with us and explore some of these issues so that we can essentially confront the bulwark of misinformation that is out there in the mainstream information, in the mainstream media, and certainly on YouTube and indeed online. Over to you, Adnan, and greetings of peace.
Thank you very much, Brother Yusuf. It's always my pleasure to be on the same platform as you. As you mentioned rightly, I was in South Africa not long ago, and we conducted a couple of programs on ITV on similar topics. So I thank you all for inviting me to address this very, very important, pressing topic of the day, which is jihad and the Indian subcontinent and its current relevance to our political situation in India. So, what is jihad? I will get straight into the topic without any delay. Jihad basically means struggle, to struggle. Literally, the word in Arabic language, it means to struggle. Now, it may come in different forms. Islamically speaking, technically, jihad means to struggle with one's tongue, speaking against oppression, or to struggle with one's pen, to write against oppression, and to struggle with a sword, to fight against oppression. So, jihad has always meant, Islamically speaking, in the history of Islam, to fight against oppression. And how do I know that? In chapter 4 of the Quran, God Almighty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالْمُسْتَضْعَفِينَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ وَالْوِلْدَانِ وَالنِّسَاءِ الَّذِينَ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا أَخْرِجْنَا مِنْ هَذِهِ الْقَرْيَةِ الظَّالِمِ أَهْلُهَا. In other words, Allah is saying that what is wrong with you, that you do not fight in the way of Allah to liberate those men, women, and children who are calling upon Allah to send someone to help them, to liberate them from oppression. So Allah in our holy book is commanding us to intervene where necessary to liberate people from oppression. This is the meaning of jihad in all cases, in all places, at all times. Now, has the meaning been misunderstood? Absolutely. Has the concept of jihad been abused? Absolutely. It was abused few times, historically speaking, but predominantly whenever the Muslims applied the concept of jihad in practical terms, they were doing it to liberate people from oppression or to defend themselves against oppression or aggression. So this is the meaning of jihad in simple terms. There are many, many reports from the Prophet of Islam. In fact, Sahih al-Bukhari, when you pick up Sahih al-Bukhari, rules pertaining to jihad are there. In Sahih al-Bukhari, there is an entire book called Kitab al-Jihad, where the rules are put down by the Prophet himself, and they have been transmitted by his companions through their students all the way up to our time, right? So we have literature coming from the Prophet we can look at with absolute confidence and believe that the Prophet ﷺ taught all these things, right? So what are these rules? What are these rules? In jihad, when in conflict, for example, firstly, when a person is speaking with his tongue, he's struggling with his tongue against oppression, he cannot misuse his tongue to oppress others. So jihad cannot become what it came to diminish. In other words, jihad itself cannot become oppression. So when people start killing innocent people, when people start killing women and children in conflict, when people start killing non-combatants or people who have nothing to do with the war or the conflict, then this becomes oppression itself. It is no longer jihad. So jihad in Islam is a virtue which essentially means to fight or struggle against oppression. The moment the struggle loses this meaning or this outlook, it ceases to become jihad. It ceases to be jihad, right? So to clarify in the very beginning, jihad cannot mean oppression, terrorism, injustice, or killing of innocent people. The moment any movement starts to become that or starts to adopt those tactics or those strategies, then this movement is no longer a jihad movement, right? So historically speaking, we have many, many examples where Prophet ﷺ waged jihad to defend his own community against oppression and against aggression of all types. And then later on, historically speaking, the Muslims did the same. Now, when you speak with your tongue, when you are struggling against oppression with your tongue, then it has to be noble. The cause has to be noble, the words have to be noble, the way has to be noble. For example, the Prophet ﷺ said, Afdalul jihad, kalimatu haqqin, عند سلطان جائر. The best of jihad is basically speaking the truth in front of a tyrannical ruler. Okay, so what truth are you speaking in front of a tyrannical ruler? Basically, you are explaining to the ruler that he is oppressive, he should stop oppression, and you defend the poor, the needy, the oppressed. Okay, this is the best of jihad the Prophet ﷺ told us about in one of his authentic narrations. Okay, likewise, writing against oppression. If you're a journalist, if you're an author, then you are writing books against oppression, not for oppression, against oppression. The moment it becomes for oppression, it is no longer jihad. It ceases to be jihad. Jihad fi sabilillah, what we call jihad fi sabilillah, struggling in the path of Allah, in the path of God. So the moment it becomes a weapon, a tool for oppression, it is no longer jihad. Likewise, using the sword or using modern weapons, for that matter, to defend the needy, the poor, the oppressed, then it is jihad. And if it's being used to oppress people, to kill innocent people, it is not jihad, it is called terrorism, right? And terrorism is never jihad. I just want to clarify this. A lot of Muslims are now, nowadays, they feel apologetic about the concept of jihad in Islam. Don't feel apologetic. Just understand what the concept means. It doesn't mean terrorism. Any campaign that kills innocent people or blows up buses and trains and civilian areas, this movement cannot be a jihad movement. That's not jihad. Okay, jihad is to fight against oppression, not for it. Okay, so having clarified this in the very beginning, we will go on to the history of India, right? A lot of Islamophobes nowadays in India, in particular, mostly from the BJP, the ruling party in India, which is an extremist, how can I put it, an extremist, fascist kind of bunch, and they have come to power, including the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, and his henchmen like Yogi Adityanath, who is the CM or Chief Minister of the largest state in India called Uttar Pradesh. It is the largest state in terms of population. It is the most populated state of India. And who is the CM? Who is the Chief Minister? It is a man called Yogi Adityanath, who is a very ignorant man. If you listen to him speak, you will know the mental capacity the man has. And then Modi has similar people around him to run the government. India has never seen this type of government in its history before. This is the first time in Indian history whereby an extremely fascist extremist group has come to power, which is brutalizing all minorities. Not only the Muslims, but also Christians, Dalits, and Sikhs are being brutalized, marginalized, and oppressed by this extremist government. And many people think this government basically represents the majority of India. That may be a misconception. They may have had most votes, but they do not have the sympathies of the Indian people. India is a great civilization. It is a mixed civilization. It is multicultural, multi-religious. It has been so for thousands of years. At least for 2,000 years, we have seen that India has been multicultural. To take that away from India is to take the beauty of the land away from it. Okay, the reason India is great, the reason Indian civilization is beautiful is because of this multiculturalism and all the different people and ethnicities living side by side for centuries. So what has changed now? An ideology has come to rule India. Okay, and this ideology was pioneered in the early 20th century by some extremist Hindu thinkers, and they used history. They used history as the source of inspiration, or distorted form of history rather. They used a very distorted form of history as the source of inspiration to come up with this extremist fascist ideology called the Hindutva movement. Okay, what is Hindutva? Hindutva, basically, to put it in simple terms, is no different to what ISIS represents today, or what KKK represented in the American South once upon a time, or what the Nazis were up to not very long ago, or just about 70 years ago, right? This is what Hindutva represents. Hindutva is no different to these organizations or these ideologies I have just mentioned, right? It is another extremist, fascist uh, ideology which is self serving, selfish, and very insular, very basically, how can I put it? Very, very self-centered in that sense. It's based upon a distorted view of Indian ethnicity. It only represents a small segment of the Indian society, which is very, very extreme, similar to what we have in the Muslim world in the form of ISIS or people who think like ISIS, right? Or in Nazi Germany. I mean, of course, there was a point when Hitler was a very popular leader, no doubt. But later on, the Germans, I mean, if you went to Germany today, you will find very few people who would agree with Hitler. Right now, as we speak in India, there are millions of people who abhor the ruling party. They abhor the ideology this party is upholding. They abhor the ideologues of this party who basically came about in the early 20th century during the British period. Okay. So, what are we talking about? We are dealing with an ideology which uses history in a very distorted form to get its ends. Okay, to reach its ends, it will distort history, it will completely twist history or remove history altogether from textbooks. As I mentioned earlier, that India is a multicultural land with a lot of diversity in religions and ethnicities. If we take the theory of Aryan or Indo-Aryan migrations seriously, then it makes it very clear for us that India as a country is a mixture of different ethnicities, and this goes back in the ancient period, as far as almost 3 to 4 thousand years ago, right? When a lot of people started to migrate from Central Asia into India, and these migrations were called Indo-Aryan migrations. A lot of Indian extremists, or these Hindutva extremists rather, I shouldn't call them Indian extremists, I should call them Hindutva extremists. A lot of them, they actually don't accept this theory because it debunks their ideology, right? So these people came in from the north and they inhabited the northern territories of India. And then the native people were driven southwards towards the southern India, and they were divided into mainly two ethnicities: the Indo-Aryans in the north and the Dravidians in the south, the dark-skinned Dravidians who inhabit the south of India or the Indian peninsula today, right? So why am I talking about this? I'm discussing the diversity of ethnicity in India. India has never been monolithic. It has never been homogeneous as a host land, right? As a land which hosted a lot of people from different backgrounds, from different religions, right? And the history of India is very, very dynamic. To make it one-track minded, to make it simplistic, to make it belonging to one particular clan, one particular class, one particular religion, to claim it for one particular ideology for that matter, is absolute injustice and extremism, historic extremism to say the least, right? So what do the historians say about all these historical narratives used by the Hindutva goons today in India? Okay, the propagandists or the peddlers, Hindutva peddlers on Twitter and beyond, right? Or on other platforms. What do the historians have to say about them? Historians are very clear. When I say historians, I mean serious Indian historians who have credentials from major Indian and non-Indian institutions. There are Western historians writing in Western lands. There are historians from within India who are writing on history, and they are very much against the Hindutva narrative of history. They believe Hindutva is distorting history, it is destroying history, it is rewriting history, completely debunking what was basically penned in the last 200 years within the schools of history in India. So what are the Hindutva goons using? They are using some of the 19th century collections made by the British colonial propagandists. What do I mean by that? During the British period in the 19th century, there was a war of independence. In 1857, the Indians arose to basically oust or basically take power away from the British Raj. The British came to power in the Indian subcontinent in the mid 18th century following the Battle of Plassey. The Battle of Plassey took place in 1757 when the British started to take land in India. They took the land of Bengal firstly, then Bihar and Orissa. Three provinces were basically written away by the then Mughal Emperor Shah Alam, and the British took the rights to raise taxation from these lands, right? And since then, the British were taking more and more land by the year or by every single decade. You would see that the British land was increasing, right? It was, geographically speaking, the British rule was spreading. And at that time, it was a company ruling India. It was called the East India Company. Okay, it was a trading company which had come to power, which had a private army, and this private army was being used, highly trained, highly equipped, okay, highly sophisticated, possibly one of the most modern armies in India at the time. And this trading company, to acquire land, to usurp thrones from princely states in India, that resulted due to the fall of the Mughal Empire. When the Mughals fell in the mid 18th century, when Mughals lost the influence, political and military influence in India, this expansion of the British Raj basically resulted from that particular collapse of the Mughal Empire. And many princely states came about as a result. And these princely states, one by one after another, were annexed or usurped by the British Raj. So cut the long story short, moving fast forward to the 19th century. In 1857, there was a mutiny on the part of the Indians. The Muslims and the Hindus predominantly, they arose to fight the British out of India. They wanted to kick the British out of India due to their oppressive policies. The details are far too many for me to discuss in this introductory lecture. So the result was the defeat of the Indian coalition, and the British came to power once again, having defeated the mutineers and the rebels in 1857. Why did the mutiny take place, and why was it a failure? Why did they not succeed in ousting the East India Company is a very interesting topic, and you can go back to some of the books on the Indian mutiny and look at the details, inshallah ta'ala. One of them I can recommend is by David Soul David. He has written a history of the Indian mutiny, and there are many other works you can look at. But none of these works is perfect because some of them are inclined to colonial apologetics. I mean, some of these authors are apologists for the colonial rule. So they will basically put their own narrative, their own understanding, or their own spin of history in their books. But these are very interesting histories to read. Moving forward, what was the result of this defeat of the Indians in 1857? The Muslims were blamed entirely for the mutiny, even though initially it was started by the Hindus. There was one particular Hindu soldier, his name was Mangal Pandey, in Meerut, in the barracks of Meerut in India. He started the mutiny, and later on the Muslims joined the mutiny also. And then the Mughal emperor, or the last nominal Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, had to be involved. He was forced into it, rather. He wasn't actually interested in this conflict, but he was forced into leading this mutiny. And later on, he was exiled, he was put on trial, and he died in Rangoon or Yangon, current-day Burma. Current-day Burma, his tomb is still there. He was a poet. He was not a warrior. He was not even a king in the real sense of the word. He was forced into this conflict. So the result was the Muslims were blamed entirely for the mutiny by the British. And for that, the British started to produce propaganda to not only tarnish the Muslim civilization, but the Muslims living in the 19th century. So the purpose was to tarnish the Muslim civilization and take away Muslim pride from them. When Muslims talked about the great monuments, the great achievements of the rulers who ruled India for nearly 700 years or 600 years up to the 19th century, Muslims had this very great civilization in India to be proud of. Muslims had the monuments and the achievements of the Delhi Sultanate to be proud of. Muslims had the great achievements of the Mughals to be proud of, right? So to take all of this away, what some of these British propagandists, colonial propagandists did, they produced works of history, right? And one of those collections is called Eliot and Dowson collection. Eliot and Dowson collection was a mixture of chronicles or actually excerpts from chronicles chosen very carefully and put together for this very purpose to basically tarnish the civilization of Islam or its history. Okay, so what did they do? Eliot and Dowson were two scholars, colonial propagandists who chose specifically those hostile passages from Muslim chronicles written during the Muslim period in India. Okay, for example, they took passages from the history of Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, who invaded India multiple times in the 10th and the 11th century. Actually, in the 11th century, more so than the 10th century. In fact, he came to power in the 10th century, and it was in the 11th century when he started to invade India in the early 1000s, right? So his history, passages chosen selectively to present a hostile image of these Muslim invasions and giving them a very religious twist. At the same time, later Delhi Sultanate chronicles passages were chosen very carefully from the works of scholars like Ziauddin Barni, who was a very, or scholars like Siraj Minhaj, who wrote Tabaqat-e-Nasiri, another history of the Delhi Sultanate, and writings like that. Basically, they took excerpts from the works of these scholars. Then later on, from the Mughal period, again, some excerpts were chosen carefully. So these excerpts consisted of details on massacres, mass murder on the part of the Muslim sultans, and they were put together selectively to make one point, that the British rule is far more just, it is far more humane than what the Indians had gone through during the Muslim period. This was the purpose of Eliot and Dowson collection, right? So later historians in the early 20th century completely debunked this collection as colonial propaganda. They clarified that this collection was put together for that purpose. The purpose was to tarnish the history of the Muslim civilization and paint it as a barbaric enterprise, as a viciously violent and mass murdering enterprise, not an enterprise of advancement of knowledge and monuments and coexistence. So this was the purpose, and this was specifically done to praise the British Raj, okay, to inflate the profile of the British Raj as a champion of civility, humanity, coexistence, and justice, right? So later on in the 20th century, even during the British period, historians writing within India, they started to challenge this collection, and they said all of these accounts are exaggerated. They cannot be trusted because they're medieval accounts. They were mostly exaggerated to inflate the image of the king or the dynasty. And a lot of these authors writing these histories were writing panegyrics. They were writing basically flattering works to flatter their rulers. And in that process, they exaggerated a lot of details about temple desecrations and killings of civilians during war and all that, right? All those things were exaggerated. So later on, in the mid 20th century and late 20th century, most historians completely abandoned that approach to history, and they clarified that this version of history is completely distorted. Now, what is the Hindutva movement doing in India today? It is using a debunked, outdated narrative of history, which was produced predominantly mostly by Eliot and Dawson. Okay, I repeat, Hindutva goons, Hindutva politicians, Hindutva propagandists, and so called Hindutva historians who are actually not historians. These are a bunch of, how can I put it, pseudo intellectuals who are peddling that same narrative that was put together by Eliot and Dawson in the 19th century and later on debunked by most professional historians, right? Hindutva is using that particular narrative to inflate hatred of Muslims today and to put Muslims on the back foot, to make Muslims apologize for the crimes that were never committed, historically speaking, right? And we can discuss some of the details that are being used by propagandists and Islamophobes, outright Islamophobes, and haters like Robert Spencer. People like Robert Spencer and others like K.S. Lal. I think Spencer has used K.S. Lal a lot. K.S. Lal was an Indian historian. He was an Indian historian. Initially, his works were very, very good when he attained his PhD. I'm talking about K.S. Lal. When he attained his PhD, his works were very good. But later on, he became more and more bigoted. As he got older, as he became closer to RSS, he was allegedly a member of the RSS as well. RSS is basically the extremist wing, or basically one of the militant wings of this extremist movement called the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, which is ruling India today. And Modi is the head of this party, currently speaking, is the prime minister, right? So he's representing the party, right? So RSS is the militant wing. And it is thought that K.S. Lal was a member and he became a propagandist for the Hindutva movement later on. And people like Robert Spencer from the US are using narratives put forward by debunked or discredited historians like K.S. Lal. No one takes K.S. Lal seriously today in the study of history, in the study of Indian history. So having clarified all of this, what was happening during the Delhi Sultanate period? I mean, I want to give you a very brief summary and then we can go to, inshallah, our Q&A very quickly. Firstly, how did the Muslims even arrive in India? And why was this history used later on to put Muslims to shame or get Muslims to apologize for crimes that were never committed? And why was it easy for the Hindutva goons and British colonial propagandists to even come up with this narrative and propaganda in the first place? Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, who ruled from 999 to 1030, he ruled for almost 30 years. He was a very powerful sultan who ruled from Ghazni, current day Afghanistan. He invaded India multiple times. For the same reason every single king would invade other territories. And Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi was an expansionist king. He wanted to expand his territories, and to raise militaries, he needed money. And Indian temples were seen as a source of money because a lot of these temples had vaults or basements full of gold and silver, basically offered to the idols. So these were offerings made by Indian worshippers or devotees of these idols and temples. Every single temple, if not every single temple, many temples throughout the Indian religious landscape were sources of immense wealth. And it so happened that every time a king would invade a territory within the Indian geographical space, they would go for the temple for two reasons. One reason is to break the idol, to destroy the deity, to basically to destroy the morale of the opposing army. So when the king, I mean, there are two ways to basically decrease or destroy the morale of the opposing army. One is to kill the king. If the king dies in conflict, the army has no reasons to fight any longer. These armies would cease fighting. And the other way to basically demoralize the army of the enemy is to destroy the deity. When the deity is destroyed, when the idol is broken, then the army, the military becomes demoralized. And this is what Hindu kings were doing to each other. Richard Eaton, in his recent book, India in the Persianate Age from 1000 to 1750s, in his book, in the very beginning, in the introducing chapters of his book, he puts down many examples of Indian kings invading each other's territories and destroying temples in the process. So I repeat, Hindu kings fighting each other for decades, in some cases for centuries, and destroying temples in the process, desecrating temples, destroying idols. So this was an Indian phenomenon even before the Muslims arrived in India. So to put all the blame on Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi for temple desecrations or for looting temples, for that matter, is unjust. Okay, to single out Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi or later Delhi Sultanate sultans is absolute anachronism. To accuse them of a crime which was invented way before them is basically anachronism, to say the least, right? So Richard Eaton puts down many examples where Hindu kings invaded other Hindu territories and they did similar things. So this was an Indian phenomenon because temples were basically an attractive source of income for kings invading territories. They would go to the temple, they would destroy the temple and take the wealth. And this is exactly what Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi did when he came into India. Wherever he found money and gold, he would go and he would invade the territory. And he called it jihad. No doubt, he called it his jihad. He called it jihad against oppression. He saw all of these entities in India as oppressive, and he saw them basically as a source of income also at the same time. And he came into India and he did what he did. So later on, the Delhi Sultanate sultans were similarly gaining a lot of territory in the Indian South. And many times the Hindu kings were coming back and taking this territory. Now, in the case of Delhi Sultanate, these people predominantly were Turkic originally. They came from Central Asia, right? The Delhi Sultanate period started from the year 1200. To be precise, Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi was basically the first person to invade India from the north in the 11th century, and the Ghaznavids remained in power more or less for nearly 200 years. And then another power came from Afghanistan called the Ghurids. They defeated the Ghaznavids and they took power from the Ghaznavids or their powerhouse called Lahore. Lahore was the first major center of political Islam in India, and that was taken by the Ghurids from the Ghaznavids. And then the Ghurids, basically led by a man called Mu'izzuddin Muhammad bin Sam Ghori, he invaded India in 1190s. In the year 1192, he defeated one of the most powerful kings in northern India called Prithviraj Chauhan. Prithviraj Chauhan was defeated by Sultan Mu'izzuddin Muhammad bin Sam Ghori, also known as Shihabuddin Ghori. Prithviraj Chauhan was defeated by him in 1192 in the Battle of Tarain, and as a result, lo and behold, what came was the Delhi Sultanate established in the city of Delhi or through the city of Delhi. So the powerhouse of Islam in India shifted from Lahore to Delhi because the establishment of Sultan Mu'izzuddin Muhammad bin Sam Ghori was firmly placed in Delhi. And then Ghori died in 1206, and his slaves thenceforth took power and they ruled for a very long time. I mean, then this came to be known as the slave dynasty of India, right? Also known as the Delhi Sultanate. Give and take, they ruled for almost 330 years. until Babur came to rule India in 1526. So the Delhi Sultanate period is generally, basically by historians, although different dynasties ruled through this period, they call this the Delhi Sultanate period from 1206 or 1200 rather to 1526, when Mughals took power from the Delhi Sultanate sultans. Right during this period, during the Delhi Sultanate period, a lot of conflicts took place, a lot happened, and details are far too many for me to discuss. And I recommend a book strongly on the topic of how basically Muslims rule India and the Muslim period in India. One is Richard Eaton's India in the Persianate Age. India in the Persianate Age. Richard Eaton's book is a very powerful introduction to the history of Muslim dynasties in India from the year 1000 to 1750. And also a book by Jamal Malik, Islam in South Asia. Very powerful book. These two books are essential readings for anyone who wants to understand the history of Indian Islam or Islam in India, politically speaking. Two books, if not more, inshallah ta'ala. For Mughals, I mean, I strongly recommend F.F. Richards. Unfortunately, I couldn't cover a lot of history and a lot of the achievements of the Mughals and the Delhi Sultanate. For that, you can look at my YouTube channel. I have some talks and lectures on these topics. I have a lecture on the Mughal Empire, which is detailed. I mean, still introductory. It is not the detail of every single emperor and his doings, but it is an introductory lecture on the Mughal Empire. And likewise, a brief history of the Muslim civilization in India. It's like a documentary, and you can watch it. Okay. Also, before I finish, before I end, I want to talk about the Delhi Sultanate period. One of the things a lot of these Hindutva propagandists today focus on is the Delhi Sultanate period, and again, the demolition and desecration of many Hindu temples and a lot of the building material like stones and other materials taken from these temples and used to build mosques. It is true, this did take place. This is archaeologically confirmed and this is historically confirmed that a lot of the building materials were taken from mosques and they were used in temples. But the same was happening on the Hindu side. When Hindu kings were invading Muslim territories, they were demolishing mosques and using the building material to build temples. And this has happened. Now, the reason why we cannot find traces of mosques within temples is because the materials used in mosques were very simple. There were no idols or carvings in mosques. Mosques were very simple, right? That's why you cannot see a block that came from a mosque put in a temple. But the other way around, on the other hand, when you look at some of the mosques, they used blocks from Hindu temples, and you can see the carvings to this day of idols. And idols have been deformed, obviously, because they're being used in a mosque. So this phenomenon was, by the way, reciprocal. This was not one-sided. Both sides were doing this, and this was a dynamic history. There was no anti-Hindu policy on the part of the Delhi sultans or the Mughal kings. Mughal kings and Delhi sultans did not pursue an anti-Hindu policy. Rather, they had employed Hindus within the state. In fact, some of the lenders, some of the treasurers, bankers were mostly Hindus in Delhi. In fact, Hindus were celebrating their festivals like Diwali and Holi throughout the Muslim period without any interruption. In fact, the Muslim sultans gave protection to Hindus within the Muslim domain. There are so many inscriptions. There is so much epigraphic record left behind by Hindus in the Sanskrit language that states or that shows how the Muslim sultans protected the Hindus. Hindus sometimes even paid lavish tributes to Muslim sultans for all the justice and protection they had to offer. But this doesn't mean Hindus are never brutalized. This never means Hindus were never killed in conflict. This never means that no temples were destroyed. Of course, there were temples destroyed. Of course, there were conflicts. Where there was a political conflict, there was destruction. War always comes with killing and destruction on both sides. To paint the Muslims with a special brush as mass murderers, as barbarians, is absolute injustice. This is not history, this is propaganda. Okay? Because when you look at the Hindu kings on the other side, okay, they were doing the same. Or even if you look at Ashoka, who was a Buddhist king, okay, in ancient India, right? Ashoka was a Buddhist king. He also committed atrocities while he was conquering lands and taking lands. Of course, he was very principled in many ways, no doubt. We know about his principles. Because of his Buddhist faith, he was restrained, but to establish justice, to expand his domains, to crush rebellions, he was also using violence, right? All kings at all times, in all places, have to resort to violence, to crush rebellions, to stay in power, to strengthen their domain. Okay? This is how history is. All civilizations are by nature, all civilizations, and I'm saying this with confidence, all civilizations by nature are expansionists, right? Right now, as we speak, there are civilizations that are very powerful and they are also expansionists. Look at the American civilization. The Americans are expanding globally. Americans have military bases all over the world. Russians, as we speak, are right now going into Ukraine, right? Or the issue of Crimea. We are aware of it, right? Britain is still expanding economically, right? So expansion is an essential trait of all civilizations. How civilizations expand and what they do after expansion is what is important. Okay? To take away the phenomenon called expansion from civilizations is not doing history. It is inventing something that doesn't exist. But if you look at all civilizations, historically speaking, they were by nature, by default, expansionist. What they do after expansion is important, right? This is where the Delhi Sultanate period and Mughals, after expanding, what they did to the masses needs to be studied more carefully. Even Mughals, I mean, Audrey Trusk is a very important scholar on Mughal history. She has talked about how Hindus lived under the Mughals. He has written two books on this topic in particular. One is titled A Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court. He argues that the Sanskrit language went through a renaissance during the Mughal period. Likewise, she has written another book recently, and I forgot the title. The exact title is not in my mind, but the book is something like Muslim civilization or Muslim history through Sanskrit sources. Okay, so she's used the Sanskrit sources to see how the Hindus writing in the Sanskrit language saw the Muslim domain or the Muslim dynasties or the Muslim civilization in general, right? So, my brothers and sisters, I will have to stop here. My time is up, and I don't think I can give more details at this stage. A lot more can be discussed. I have raised some important points, and I haven't spoken much about the achievements of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. They are well known. Apart from the Taj Mahal, apart from the Qutub Minar, there is a lot to look at in the fields of literature, the fields of science, in the fields of military advancement, and in the fields of economics. For example, the richest country in the world in the 16th century was India. The richest country in the world was India throughout the 16th century and the 15th century, actually. Sorry, not 15th, 16th and the 17th century. Aurangzeb Alamgir, the most tarnished emperor, the most tarnished Mughal emperor as far as the Hindutva goons are concerned, was the most powerful, the most influential, and the richest king in the world. The Indian GDP was 24% of the world. 24% of global GDP was in India during the reign of Aurangzeb Alamgir. Aurangzeb Alamgir, who ruled from 1658 to 1707, almost 50 years. Aurangzeb Alamgir employed more Hindus in his state than all the Mughal emperors put together before him. So up to the point when Aurangzeb came to power, 3 Mughal emperors had ruled. Of course, more had ruled, but 3 powerful Mughal emperors had ruled, right? Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. Aurangzeb employed more Hindus within his state apparatus than all the Mughal emperors put together before him. 31% of Aurangzeb's military and state uh, was made of Hindus. 31%. Okay, so if Muslims were bigots, if Muslims are out to destroy Hindus, to massacre Hindus, why would Muslim kings and religious kings, religiously Muslim kings like Aurangzeb, why would they employ Hindus on such large numbers within the state? Why would they do that? These are some very pressing questions one can look at. Also, Delhi Sultanate. The final point I wanna raise before I go to Brother Yusuf, and he can ask his questions, and we can go to Q&A. The Delhi Sultanate period, one particular contribution to the Indian civilization or one particular achievement is very often overlooked by historians and in particular Hindutva propagandists. And what is that? The Mongol invasions of India. Mongols invaded India for more than 100 years. For over 100 years, the Muslim sultans stood in the way of the Mongols like an iron wall. The Muslim sultans lost their loved ones in these battles, in these wars against Mongols protecting India. Now, one can argue, no, they were not protecting India. They were protecting their own power. They were protecting their power hubs. They were protecting their own politics and their own militaries and their own rule. So they had no interest in protecting India. This is a false impression created by Hindutva goons if they ever talk about the Mongol invasions. Firstly, they don't talk about it. If they do, this is how they spin it, right? But what they don't know is that Hindus fought side by side with Muslims to push away the Mongols. Now, you can say that about the Muslim sultans because you hate the Muslims. You can say that about the Muslim sultans. But what are you going to say about those Hindu generals who fought with the Muslims side by side to repel the Mongol invasions? What are you going to say about that? And one battle in particular, I want to mention very quickly. Actually, two examples I want to mention. Sultan Ghiyasuddin Balban was a very powerful sultan during the Delhi Sultanate period. He ruled from 1266 to 1287. 1266 to 1287 CE. He was one of the most powerful sultans the Delhi Sultanate period ever witnessed, right? And one of his sons, his heir apparent, his Waliul Ahad, the man, his favorite son who was going to succeed his father to the throne, was killed in a battle against the Mongols. Prince Muhammad, also known as the martyred prince or the Shahid prince, was killed in a battle against the Mongols near Lahore, whereby the famous Muslim poet from India called Amir Khusro was also present in the battle. He was an eyewitness, and he explained and he described as to what happened in this particular battle. Sultan Ghiyasuddin Balban gave his own son to protect India. Likewise, later on, the Khaljis came to power in the year 1299 CE. 1299 CE, one of the largest Mongol invasions took place. The Chagatai ruler of Afghanistan, called Qutl Khwaja, he invaded India with over 100,000 men. According to some sources, 200,000 men. Sultan Alauddin Khalji and his generals, they stood like an iron wall in the way of the Mongols to protect not only the Delhi Sultanate, but wider India. Imagine if the Mongols had come into India. Imagine what would happen to your temples. Imagine what would happen to the gold. And by the way, amazingly, the temples that were desecrated were only those that were politically important during the Muslim period. But Mongols would not discriminate. They would come in and they would destroy every single temple standing in their way. They would have destroyed the populations like they did from eastern Turkestan all the way up to Syria. they decimated the Muslim civilization in the East. And later on, of course, they themselves became the defenders of the same civilization, having destroyed much of it. And the Delhi Sultans, they protected India against the Mongols for over 100 years. So remember the Battle of Kili, that took place in 1299, where Sultan Alauddin Khalji, he stood like an iron wall against the Mongols, and the Mongols were defeated. A general fighting for the Khaljis or for the Delhi Sultanate called Zafar Khan was killed while fighting in this very battle. And the leader of the Mongols were also killed in this battle. So I'll stop here. And you must remember all these contributions of the Muslim sultans in defending and protecting India against foreign threats. And there are many, many more things I can talk about in this regard, but the time does not permit me to do so. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters. To me. Over to you, rather, Brother Yusuf.
Jazakallah, thank you very much, Adnan. That was a fascinating discourse. Just listening to you, I was fascinated because, a lot of us, and I'm not just talking about the lay people, but many of us that are involved in debate and interfaith dialogue and dawah, for that particular matter, have not kind of delved in deeply into this particular unique aspect of history, which is now coming to the fore, particularly being raised by the far right. And what kind of interested me, although I had a kind of a brief overview or read up about what had happened in India, and particularly in relation to the Mughal invasion, what triggered my interest in this was, strangely enough, the writings of the individual you mentioned, Robert Spencer, who wrote the book The History of Jihad, where a significant portion of the book, in fact, focuses on this specific period in history, which you have quite fascinatingly articulated and cleared up a lot of issues. But I want you to tackle some of these myths. For example, you mentioned quite at length Mahmud Ghazni. Is that the individual you were speaking about? And the kind of myths go around like this, that Mahmud Ghazni was the individual who started the whole process of the invasion into the Indian subcontinent. And this invasion, in fact, continued through many of the subsequent invaders over several centuries. And then you have myths. Now, somebody of his caliber that purportedly is supposedly relying on facts, he throws out things, for example, that, under Ghazni and then subsequently under him, Nadir Shah, he speaks about having made a mountain of skulls of the Hindus in India that he killed. Then he raised about the fact, and I don't know whether these are myths or these are terminologies that are used. They use the aspect or the example of Babur. Babur raised towers of Hindu skulls at Khanua when he defeated Rana Sanga in the 16th century, I believe. And later, apparently, this happened at the fort of Chanderi. Then there's talk about King Akbar, who is generally viewed as someone that is the benevolent savior of the Hindus in kind of conventional literature. Spencer describes Akbar as having committed a general massacre of having killed 30,000 Rajputs. Then he speaks about the Brahmani sultans having an annual agenda of killing a minimum of 100,000 Hindus every year. Now, the point being made, Adnan, is
let's take each one of these examples one by one very quickly. I'm not going to spend much time because they're so easy to debunk. It's just absolutely fascinating that how lying propagandists and money-driven, these shameless authors, shameless authors like Spencer have the audacity to, and you know why they're writing books like this? Because they know they will find an audience in India. They will find an audience in India, and there are people like Spencer and other Islamophobes who are very popular in India for the reasons we already understand. So let's take each one of these examples one by one, and we can see whether these examples stand the test of history. So let's talk about Babur's Tower of Skulls, right? Okay. So let's assume Babur did that for a second. Let's assume Babur did that. But what Spencer and people like him will not talk about is Babur's invasion of India and who was he fighting against? Who did Babur oust from India? When Babur took India, who was ruling India is the question. Or let's say northern India, because the Lodhis did not rule all of India. The Lodhis were ruling northern India. Babur was fighting Ibrahim Lodhi, right? Ibrahim Lodhi was a Muslim. He was one of the remnants of the Delhi Sultanate, right? And Babur removed a Muslim dynasty from power. So when Babur was fighting the Lodhis, or when he fought Ibrahim Lodhi in the Battle of Panipat in 1526, was he specifically picking Hindus on the battlefield when he was fighting the Lodhis, or was Babur also killing Muslims in the process? This is what these bigots, these extremists, these lying propagandists will not address. When Babur invaded India in 1526 from Afghanistan, he came via Afghanistan. Babur was actually from Central Asia. And Babur had already been fighting his cousins, his relatives in Central Asia to take back his land in Farghana, in the valley of Farghana. So Babur started by fighting his own relatives. Such was the nature of those times. Kings were not living in utopias. Kings did not have defined borders. The concept of nation state with defined borders is a recent concept. It is a recently secular concept, right? In the Middle Ages, or in India at that time, in the 15th and the 16th century, the borders were not defined. So kings often traversed territories and fought each other. This was a natural occurrence, right? When there is power, there is stretching of the muscles, right? So Babur lost his territory in Central Asia. He came to Afghanistan, and it was difficult for him to stay in Afghanistan also. So he was looking beyond Afghanistan. And who does he remove from power? Ibrahim Lodhi. And then another Hindu comes to fight him, Rana Sanga, and Babur fights them. So in order to make these people an example, every single king, to seem strong, to appear strong, they would commit atrocities. And these atrocities are not necessarily Islamic. So there is no doubt Babur might have committed atrocities. Was he doing this because of Islam? They may have used the name of jihad. Amazingly, when Babur was fighting Lodhi, the question is, did he use the word jihad for that particular conflict? And if it was jihad, how can it be jihad when you are removing one Muslim dynasty and replacing it with your own dynasty, right? How is that jihad? How can he justify it? But when it came to Hindus, Muslim kings very often, as a propaganda tool, the expansionist ambitions, they used the slogan of jihad to arouse feelings, no doubt. But to accuse Babur of single-handedly committing atrocities specifically against Hindus is not only distortion, it is, how can I put it? It is, what is the strong word for lying and cheating? This is absolute madness. This is absolute madness.
So as I understand it, Adnan, what you are saying is that these are kind of political wars of conquest in the course of events. I mean, the rulers went and then they conquered, and the religious element was purely incidental in relation. Now, the one point which I want to tie up, because you raised him, the most controversial person that you also articulated there, Aurangzeb, because they're saying that, well, look, if we make the argument that these kings, and I'm just playing the devil's advocate, these kings were purely incidentally Muslims, or that religion was purely incidental, but the actions were more political conquest than religious warfare. They use the argument of Aurangzeb on the basis that, he in fact, Spencer quotes somebody, I think he quotes Lal, by describing him as a vile oppressor of Hindus by virtue of the fact that he intended to forcibly convert Hindus to Islam and destroy Hindu temples, or by virtue of the fact that they were polytheists. You see, the argument that is being raised by Spencer, they use the Surah 9 verse 29, the verse on the jizya, and they argued that Hindus were not people of the book. So therefore, there was no option of jizya to be imposed upon the Hindus. There were two options that they faced. Then these Muslim leaders came, and the one option is that they came and offered them Islam, and the alternative to that is that if they do not accept, by virtue of the fact that they are not people of the book and they cannot be subjected to having the jizya tax imposed on them, therefore this necessarily had to result in their total destruction, elimination, and so on. And Aurangzeb is obviously cited as the key figure in relation to that. So you mentioned Richard Eaton, that kind of gave the idea that this was not something that was directed towards Hindu temples, but in the light of kings taking over land, to conquering the temple or destroying the temple was seen as amassing property as opposed to religious warfare. Can you just expand on that aspect?
Very quickly, I want to address the issue of Akbar as well. When you mentioned Spencer referring to Akbar as a mass murderer of Hindus, you could not use a worse example, and you could not use a worse example than Akbar in this regard. Akbar had married a Hindu woman called Jodhabai, who was Rajput. Akbar's brother-in-law and his father-in-law were in his court, serving him day and night. And one of the strongest generals of Akbar was Man Singh, who was a Rajput. Okay, so you could not use a worse example than that. It's unbelievable.
And that's the example Spencer used. It's shocking. It's shocking, the level of his poor discourse.
Yeah, and Rajputs had one of the most powerful existence. They had one of the most powerful presences in the Mughal court. Rajputs throughout the Mughal period. Okay, and I'm saying all of the Mughal period, the entire Mughal period, for nearly 200 to 300 years, depending on how powerful the Mughals were at that time. Firstly, the most powerful reigns of the Mughals, let's say the four reigns, Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb. Rajputs had a very powerful presence in the Mughal court. They were seen as a very, very important element of the Mughal political establishment. Okay, Rajputs were Mughals, and I'm going to say this again. Rajputs, while maintaining their Hindu identity, while celebrating their festivals, while keeping their territories and their palaces and being given land grants by the Mughal emperors, were essentially Mughals in their identity, right? They referred to themselves as Mughal vassals. They married into Mughals. They gave their daughters to Mughals, right? Because it wasn't forbidden for Hindus to give their daughters to Muslims. The Rajputs didn't have a problem with that. So Rajputs were giving their daughters in marriage to Mughal princes, right? In fact, the mother of Jahangir, one of the most powerful Mughal emperors, was Rajput, Jodhabai, right? And there are other examples whereby Hindu women gave birth to some of the most powerful Mughal nobles. So you could not be more deceptive and dishonest and disingenuous about history than these propagandists like Spencer. Okay, and also talking about Aurangzeb. Just to answer this question, I will just recommend one book. Okay, that book is titled "Nobility Under Aurangzeb." Okay, the book is "The Mughal Nobility Under Aurangzeb," and the author is M. Athar Ali. M. Athar, Athar Ali, Ali. Okay, so the Mughal Nobility Under Aurangzeb, published by the Oxford University Press. It is an academic source, unlike the books of Spencer and other propagandists like that. Okay, go and see how he statistically shows, Athar Ali shows, statistically, that 31% of the nobility during the reign of Aurangzeb consisted of Hindus, predominantly Rajputs. So why, if Aurangzeb was an anti-Hindu bigot, if he wanted the Hindus destroyed, why would you have 31%? Okay, that's 1/3 of your state. 1/3 of your state. Why would you have Hindus running that 1/3? It doesn't make sense. It is absolutely shocking and fascinating that these people have an audacity to come out with these lies and these misrepresentations of history. And unfortunately, this is now a popular narrative in India. A lot of people have been conditioned into thinking this way, and that's why more and more is needed from scholars and from public speakers and influentials to talk about these things and debunk these narratives peddled by right-wing liars and deceivers like Robert Spencer, who are doing it for money just to sell their book to the Indian audience. No serious student of history will take Spencer seriously. If you were to quote Spencer as a source in your undergraduate essay, you will be marked down. I can guarantee you. I'll
agree with that.
I can guarantee you this, that if you quoted Spencer in the footnotes in one of your undergraduate essays, let alone postgraduate, undergraduate essays, you will be marked down by your teacher, your historian, because they don't allow you to use propaganda unless it is a study of Spencer, unless it is the study of Spencer's deranged mind. Why would people like Spencer produce works like this? I mean, that's also an academic question. It's an interesting question.
Of course, definitely.
Yeah. So if you were studying Spencer as a phenomenon of lying and cheating and deception, then of course it would be acceptable for you to quote him. But if you are making a point on history, you would be thrown out. Your paper would be thrown out. Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised. The other point that is raised is that, and you go further up the centuries, 1757, I think you may have mentioned the Afghan ruler, Ahmad Shah Abdali.
Yes.
And there's a quotation given by him in the book, which is purportedly from a chronicle called the Tariq al-Alamgiri. And here, I don't know how true, how accurate this is, but it apparently details the fact that when Ahmad Shah in 1757 made his way to the Hindu city of Mathura, the Bethlehem, the so-called birthplace of Krishna, as they claim. And in the Tariq al-Alamgiri, this is a quotation that is given, how true or authentic. I want you to address this, where he says that Abdali's soldiers would be paid 5 rupees for every enemy head brought in. Every horseman had loaded up all his horses with the plundered property, and atop it rode the girl captives and the slaves. The severed heads were tied up in rugs like bundles of grain and placed on the heads of captives. Then the heads were stuck upon lances and taken to the gate of the chief minister for payment. It was an extraordinary display. Daily did this man of slaughtering and plundering proceed, and at night the shrieks of women captives who were being raped deafened the ears of the people. All those heads that had been cut off were built into pillars, and the captive men upon whose heads, whose bloody bundles had been brought in, were made to grind corn, and then their heads too were cut off. I mean, this is like a fairy tale horror movie, but he quotes a source from the Tariq al-Alamgiri and apparently details the so-called invasion of Mathura in 1757. How true is this account? Because, I mean, this seems like where did this particular narrative comes from? It's like out of a horror fiction, and this is cited as an authentic event that apparently happened within history. Can you respond to that?
I will have to look at the Persian text of this first before I can comment on it. I'm not aware of the Persian text. So
okay.
Tariq Alamgiri, first of all, I would have to look at that Persian text, right? Because I don't trust these propagandist translations,
sure.
Right? Secondly, even if the passage is there, let's say the passage is there, right? Tariq Alamgiri, from the very name, that this is a Mughal history of the Abdali invasion. The Mughals are very hostile to the Abdalis, okay? The Mughals are very hostile. The Mughal authors, in particular, people who were writing histories on the part of the Mughals, they saw Abdali as an intruder, as an invader. So again, what they don't tell you, these propagandists and these deceivers and liars in their books, what they don't tell you is that Abdali's invasions were predominantly against the Mughals. He was dismantling the Mughal Empire. Before he fought the Hindus or before he fought the Sikhs, I mean, I can tell you more things. Abdali went to the Golden Temple of the Sikhs in Amritsar and he demolished it. He razed it to the ground. Why? Because the Sikhs were repeatedly hounding him. They were attacking his caravans. They were disturbing him when he was on his way back to Afghanistan, having defeated the Marathas in the Battle of Panipat in 1761. In 1761, when Abdali was on his way back to Afghanistan, his army was being harassed repeatedly by Sikh guerrillas. So to teach them a lesson, in Abdali's terms, to teach them a lesson, he went to the Golden Temple and he razed it to the ground. Okay. Now, can we use that as a war tactic to demoralize the Sikhs? Absolutely. It was bad. It was evil. But even the Sikhs would have understood at that time why Abdali did that, right? To use these passages from medieval histories, or let's say pre-modern histories, and use the modern mind, or use our standards to judge the victors or the conquerors or the invaders of that time, it is absolutely anachronistic. You cannot use, I mean, even today we have Vietnam, we have Afghan war, we have atrocities committed on a massive scale. It makes sense for us to look at these things and be abhorred, right? But at that time, atrocities like this, okay, they were the norm, unfortunately, and we're not justifying them. We're saying they were evil atrocities. These atrocities were absolutely evil, right? But these kings were using these tactics. If they used them, they were using them first of all across the board. They were not singling out Hindus. What the Hindutva propagandists are doing is that they are saying this was all directed towards Hindus. All of these Muslim atrocities, okay, were directed towards Hindus. This is a lie, because when you look at these invasions, who was Abdali fighting? Abdalis were fighting the Marathas, Hindus, okay? Abdali was fighting the Sikhs, and Abdali was fighting Muslims. So who was he committing atrocities against is the question.
Sure.
And likewise, the Sikhs were committing atrocities against Hindus. They were committing atrocities against Muslims, and they were committing atrocities against those Sikhs they did not agree with. Did you know the Sikhs had civil wars? Did you know the Sikhs fought each other militarily? Sikhs fought each other. Hindus, the Marathas and the Rajputs fought each other, and they committed atrocities. The Muslims fought each other. So this was a very much politically charged environment where different groups were fighting each other. Okay, the 18th century in particular, the 18th century in India was the most devastating period throughout the Indian history, arguably, because the amount of bloodshed, the amount of political instability and military conflicts that took place is absolutely mind-blowing. You know, the players. Okay, it was a cocktail of ambitious invaders and atrocity committers and even mass murderers in some cases. The Marathas, arguably, the Hindu force, the Marathas, were arguably the most barbaric, the most uncivilized, and the most merciless entity in India. And I will repeat, the Marathas were the most barbaric political entity in India in the 18th century. How do we know that? We know that by looking at the atrocities. Rape was a special feature of Maratha invasions. And who is writing this, by the way? Who is writing this? Hindu historians themselves. When Marathas invaded Bengal, they used rape as a very specific weapon of war against Bengali Hindus, against Hindu landowners and landholders and the peasantry of Bengal. The Marathas
was this directed against Muslims as well?
Also
against Muslims.
Absolutely, Marathas were invading Hindu territories, Muslim territories, and Sikh territories.
So would that be Shivaji Maratha? Because
no, Shivaji. These are successors.
These are presented heroes.
This is more like Baji Rao and his successors, not Shivaji. Shivaji was mainly fighting against the Mughals during the reign of Aurangzeb. And Sambhaji was also a Maratha ruler who was Shivaji's son. But the successors of Sambhaji and Shivaji later on in the 18th century, I would say the mid 18th century in particular, was very, very disturbing period in Indian history where all people suffered. Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs, all of them suffered daily at the hands of these conflicts, or these invaders, rather, right? Abdalis, firstly, Nadir Shah's invasion from Persia in 1739. He came in, he committed atrocities against Muslims of Delhi. Delhi was destroyed systematically, and again, the Persian forces were raping, unfortunately, the Muslim population of Delhi. Okay, so history is dynamic. You cannot say that these Muslim invaders came in and they targeted the Hindus only.
Sure.
The first rulers they confronted, the first militaries they confronted, whenever the invaders came from outside, they were confronting indigenous Muslim rulers. They were confronting indigenous Muslim armies before they fought the Sikhs or the Hindus. So the most powerful armies in India for almost 500 years were Muslim armies. And they were predominantly indigenous, by the way. For the Hindutva goons to call Muslims or Mughals outsiders, okay, is an absolute lie again. Because Mughals, many of the rulers were born of Hindu women. How are they outsiders?
Yeah.
They adopted the Indian culture. They adopted the Indian language. The Mughals were very much involved in the Indian culture of the day. And to call them outsiders is basically not only racism, it is basically disowning a great civilization that contributed so much to the larger history of India.
So I want you to break this myth, because this is what's coming out from, well, besides Spence and others, they use, and you've mentioned Professor K.S. Lal, who you stated that in his older time period changed his view. But the main overall arching theme is this, is that they say, and this is a myth which we should break down, that the Hindu population in India decreased between 80 million between the 10th century and the 16th century, and they describe this as an extermination unparalleled in world history. And the argument is that the slaughter of 80 million people occurred over regular periods during what they describe the Arab, Afghan, Turkish, and Mughal rule in India. Firstly, I want to ask, where did they get these figures from? Because I think people like Amresh Misra, for example, argues something which he describes as an untold Holocaust. K.S. Lal, I mean, these seem to be the source, and that's where you've got these extremists like Robert Spencer, and then, of course, nutcases like David Wood repeating these same myths as a fact. How do you break down these figures? That's the first question. The second thing is, which I never asked, when you come to these descriptions in books like the Tariq al-Alamgiri, could they possibly also be viewed as purely hyperbole, exaggerated statements to kind of show the bravado of the conquest or the conqueror per se? If you can address those two aspects.
Okay, you see, K.S. Lal's works were actually criticized by historians like Peter Jackson in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, stating that the book of K.S. Lal, I mean, The Legacy of Muslim Rule in India, you may be referring to that particular book where he made these claims, right? The Legacy of Muslim Rule in India. As I mentioned earlier, the K.S. Lal actually became an RSS propagandist in the later years of his life, and he started writing extremely bigoted works targeting Muslims in particular, right? So historians, serious professional historians like Peter Jackson, they criticized this particular book by stating a markedly selective and one-sided account of India's Muslim past. Okay, that's what he said, right? And with regards to statistics, Simon Digby disputed Lal's study of the demographic situation in medieval India in a review in Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies. Digby stated that estimate lacks accurate date in pre-census times, right? So where were these censuses is the question. Where did Lal take these details from? Where did he get these numbers from? 80 million. I mean, in some cases, historians argue that it is absolutely impossible for the population to be that large. It is impossible. Even to create a massacre of that scale, you would need a nuclear, you would possibly need a nuclear bomb or something, right?
The population was not that large. I mean,
yeah,
is that what
absolutely.
you're saying? Never reached that
Absolutely.
stage.
And in the presence of such powerful Hindu entities like the Rajputs and later on the Marathas, how would that be possible? And the population of India today is over 1 billion. Okay, there are over a
Sure.
billion Hindus in India today. If such
It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense but I mean, these figures are thumb-sucked from somewhere. And so it seems to be speculatory, revisionist material that has come in the late 20th century or the early part of the 20th century.
A lot of these exaggerated figures are taken from Muslim chronicles, medieval Muslim chronicles. And these chronicles mostly exaggerated numbers in conflicts, right? For example, to inflate the image of the dynasty. Don't forget, the Muslim authors who are writing these chronicles, these histories, were also propagandists. They were also propagandists. Yeah. Don't forget, right? So they are writing histories mainly for propaganda purposes. They are writing for an already convinced audience and to give them a taste of, how can I put it, an inflated sense of power and victory over the enemy. They would inflate numbers drastically. So where there were 10,000 killed in a conflict, they would say 1 million were killed, for example. Okay, I'll give you an example. This is not specifically a phenomenon in India. We find it elsewhere also. For example, pick up early Muslim histories. The conflict between the Romans and the Muslims, early Islamic conquest. So what numbers are given to us when it comes to Romans? We are told that Romans were nearly 250,000, okay? And the Muslims were over 100,000. This is impossible. That number is impossible. Looking at the demographics of the time, whatever information we have available. So a moderate estimate would be 40,000 Muslims and potentially 80,000 Romans, right? But the chroniclers, when they gave the numbers, they inflated the numbers. Okay, was there a count of heads? Absolutely not. Did a person go around with a book or with a counter counting all the heads in the Roman army that they knew that 250,000? So they would simply see heads, they would see thousands of people, and they would estimate, okay, it's 200,000, 300,000. So these would be rough estimates in most cases. But in some cases, these were highly exaggerated accounts. And even of massacres, where massacres are discussed, okay, where skulls of the towers of skulls are being made and all that, even these accounts are absolutely highly exaggerated. Is Adnan Rashid saying this? Absolutely not. This is what modern historians are saying today. Every single historian of medieval India today, every single historian of medieval India, and I'm talking about professional historians, they completely reject these narratives as representative sources of facts, especially military facts, when they are discussing atrocities, military atrocities. They claim that these are highly exaggerated accounts written for propaganda purposes to inflate the image of the ruler as well as the dynasty. This is what it is. And similarly, we see the Hindu sources, they have the same problem. So generally speaking, medieval sources mostly exaggerated their atrocities and the achievements and the victories against the enemy. This is how historians understand it, and they have reasons to believe this because they have given evidence for this. They have given the evidences for this, why the historians have come up with this solution and this understanding of medieval history.
So now we will have to wrap up soon, but what I want to now basically focus on is that, as I then understand it, is that secular historians have basically broken down this myth and have given a kind of far more balanced, moderate account of what happened historically, particularly with regards to the, as you rightly put it, the multicultural India that in fact existed during the Middle Ages, specifically under Muslim rule. But the alternative viewpoint whereby Muslims are presented as this barbaric, marauding horde that was out there to destroy Indian society by virtue of the massacres and desecration of temples solely in the name of Islam. This is gaining currency, well, particularly amongst the far right, strangely enough, in the United States, represented by people like the Spencers, the Woods, Daniel Horowitz, and Emersons, and so on. And that kind of currency is now also part and parcel of the popular discourse within the Indian ruling party, the Indian elite, to the extent that it appears to me that there seems to be a deliberate attempt in terms of writing out Muslim identity from the historical existence of how India in fact developed. So, I mean, at this particular point in time in India, Muslims are in a minority. They're the largest minority, but they are not in a position of power. But why is whilst they are not in a position of a threat in a political sense to the Hindu government, why is there an attempt to write them out of existence, historically speaking, to the extent that when they are presented, even now in children's historical works in Indian society, you have this narrative that is being drummed through, which I would argue is revisionist and by no means mainstream, but gaining popular currency at a populist level, whilst it's not a mainstream view. What do you think is the kind of underlying rationale and behind that?
I have a very powerful book in this regard, which I strongly recommend for all viewers. It is by Christoph Jeffrelot. Christoph Jeffrelot is the author, and the book is titled Modi's India, Hindu Nationalism and the Rise of Ethnic Democracy. Okay, this book has been published in 2021. It is a very recent book, and you can easily find it online. So I will repeat the title, Modi's India, Hindu Nationalism and the Rise of Ethnic Democracy. This is a very, very important book on the question Brother Yusuf has just raised. And also another book I would strongly recommend by the same author, co-authored with another author. The other author is Laurent Geyer. So Laurent Geyer and Christoph Jeffrelot have written another book titled Muslims in Indian Cities, Trajectories of Marginalization. I repeat the title, Muslims in Indian Cities, Trajectories of Marginalization. So the question you just asked, Brother Yusuf, is very well answered in these two books, right? They talk about why this marginalization is taking place. Why is the Muslim history being written out of history textbooks? Why are the Muslims being tarnished? What are the political gains from this marginalization or demonization or dehumanization, for that matter, of the Muslims? And this dehumanization has gone so far that Muslims are being lynched now. Okay, India represents a very similar reality to what was happening in the American South with the Negroes. I mean, to use the wrong word. Okay, I don't mean to use the word in a derogatory sense. I'm using it in an academic sense because at that time the word Negro was used to dehumanize the black people or Afro-Americans, right? So what was happening to the Afro-Americans in the American South in the late 19th and early 20th century is happening to Muslims in India today. Lynch mobs can easily lynch Muslims. They can destroy Muslim businesses. The vigilante Hindutva goons can be walking around Muslim markets, burning shops, demolishing mosques, killing Muslims, even raping women at times is okay. It's not a problem. And all of this is a result of active demonization that resulted in dehumanization of the Muslims. It is happening today. And why is this happening is a very big question. What benefit is there from such propaganda? I think to put it in simple terms, to make it simple, it is fear-mongering for political ends, right? To get into power, BJP and RSS establishments are using Muslims as convenient punching bags. They're using them as practicing punching bags, right? And they're using them as a target, as a scapegoat for all the problems in India, right? And same things are happening in Europe, don't get me wrong, and in America. Donald Trump used Muslims as a reason for him to come to power, okay? I need to come to power because I'm going to deal with the Muslim threat. Okay, in not so many words. Modi is using the same fear-mongering against Muslims to come to power. So it has political benefit. There's no reality to this fear-mongering. And to make this fear-mongering real, they have to employ historians. They have to employ, when I say historians, pseudo-historians, okay? And they have to employ journalists. They have to employ propagandists. They have to employ politicians. So they have to spend a lot of money to gather a lot of support, even in education, even professors, even judges who are passing judgments against Muslim interests. Even the Citizen Bill recently is absolute, it's madness. To say the least, it is racist. It is a racist law.
Has that been passed? Has the Citizens Bill been passed? Did that come into effect?
Well, I don't know, but it's on table. It's on table.
Yeah.
It caused a lot of controversy. I don't know what the status is. I don't know what the current status is recently. But you must read Jeff Lott's book. It is an absolutely fascinating account of what is going on in Modi's India today, and why is it happening? What benefit do they get out of this or this propaganda against the Muslims? So that book is an essential reading for anyone interested. Modi's India by Christoph Jeff Lott.
Well, Adnan, I want to thank you for that. There's just so much more that I would like to talk to you about. I didn't, in fact, tell you that I have, in fact, tested positive for COVID, by the way, right now, presently. So I'm slightly run down and feeling under the weather. And we've got a limited time period in terms of how long we can go on for. But we would like to have you again. And in fact, I'd like to put that challenge up, and you'd be amenable to debating Robert Spencer in a public forum on this particular issue, and of course debunking some of the false misconceptions and ideas, and of course the clear falsehoods that he's contained in his particular book in the immediate future. You'd be more than willing to go ahead and challenge him to that. Would I be correct?
Absolutely. In-person debate, anywhere, anytime, inshallah. Absolutely. If he agrees, then I would like to have an in-person debate, face-to-face debate, not an online debate. I don't like online debates, but in-person debate anywhere, anytime. If he agrees, no problem.
That'll be fantastic, and we're more than willing to set up such an engagement. But thank you very much for that, Adnan. Your discourse has been appreciated. I'm sure you've certainly enlightened me and enlightened many others out there. And we'd like to get this information out there in the public sphere so that people can see the alternative to this bulwark of froth of misinformation and falsehood that is being presented by the Hindutva goons, as you rightly pointed out, the Hindutva movement, the far-right fringe elements in the United States, and many of the other allies who are part and parcel of this anti-Islamic and Islamophobic agenda. So I want to thank you for that, Adnan, and we hope to have further sessions with you in the future. This is an ongoing series from the 22nd of December to the 25th of December, where we confront Islamophobia, deal with misconceptions, and of course tackle some of the theological controversies in our different faiths. And if you've been watching us, you've been watching Adnan Rashid, a well-known speaker and public debater who is from the United Kingdom, quite popular, and his debates are online as well, and he has his own channel. Jazakallah khair, and to those out there, Assalamu alaikum.